You're listening to the Voice of Russia from London. We bring you news, features and debate live from 4 till 8 p.m, Mondays to Fridays. Tune in on DAB or online at ruvr.co.uk.
Hello there, you're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tim Walklate. In recent weeks, the Vatican has announced that, having been beatified 2 years ago, Pope John Paul II is to be canonised as a saint of the Roman Catholic Church. Evidence of 2 miracles are normally required for someone to be a candidate for sainthood, and the Vatican confirmed that the recent curing of a Costa Rican woman's aneurysm has been attributed to John Paul. He'd already been credited with curing a French nun of Parkinson's disease, something which the late Pope also suffered from in the years leading up to his death. Some have questioned whether his canonisation is being rushed through, while John Paul's sterner critics have argued his handling of the clerical sex abuse scandal that still rocks the church today tarnished his reputation. He is, however, widely regarded in the Catholic Church as one of the great popes of modern times. To discuss Pope John Paul II's canonisation, I'm joined in the studio by Ed Rennie from the media project Catholic Voices, Christopher Lamb, assistant editor for The Tablet, which is an international Catholic weekly newspaper, and Michael Walsh, a Catholic author and historian. Michael Walsh, I'd like to ask you firstly, what is canonisation?
Well, it's a process by which the Roman Catholic Church declared somebody to have been a saint. I mean, there's canonisation in other churches too. I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church does it via the Holy Synod. But in the Catholic Church, it's a process undertaken by the Congregation for the Causes of Saints residing in Rome, where they examine someone's life and miracles which are said to have been performed by this person and declare him worthy of the accolade of saint. It's a bit like being raised to the House of Lords. And
this is obviously different to beatification.
Beatification is only like being knighted. It's a stage on the way.
We all know about saints, but what is a saint? What function does a saint perform today?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. I mean, it is a very good question because I think nobody really asks what saints are for. But very often they're used for political purposes. I mean, there are 2 sorts of saints in a way. There are saints that occurred before canonisation, which is a judicial process, was invented, which is the vast majority of saints, in fact. And those who are made saints after the judicial process was introduced, which began basically in the 13th century. But as a good example, the earliest one was in 993, was Ulrich of Augsburg, and he was canonised at the request of the emperor. Actually, in this case, by a synod, the Roman Synod. He was canonised because the German emperor wanted to hold up to the other bishops in his empire a model of what a bishop ought to be. So in that sense, that was a good start. That was a typical start. Saints are sort of, in some ways, they're held up as models of what a person should be, and very often for political purposes, as in the case of Ulrich of Augsburg.
And you'd agree with...
Well, traditionally, saints are there in the spiritual definition to intercede for people in heaven. You can ask for saints' prayers for your petitions. One of the traditional functions of a saint. There's also the feast day. Of course, you celebrate the saints' feast day every year, and it become part of the life of the church, the spiritual life of the church. So I would agree with what Michael said, but just add that extra sort of spiritual definition towards it.
And Ed, Pope John Paul, what sort of function would he perform as a saint?
Well, my parish priest used to say that saints are for inspiration, not imitation. And they're there to inspire us to see the divine grace of God acting in this world. And we see that in John Paul II in terms of the heroic virtues, which are part of the process. You have to have demonstrated these in your life. And I think the profoundly extraordinary life that Karol Wojtyła had, even leading up to becoming Pope, living under totalitarian regimes from the ages of 19 to 58. It's quite an extraordinary life he had, working with the resistance, both under the Nazis and the totalitarian, writing plays, developing a culture that was needed to survive those regimes which were profoundly atheistic and trying to destroy the faith.
Obviously that is part of the process of becoming a saint, but how do you become a saint?
Well, in terms of the process, it's a twofold process, but typically both have to demonstrate miracles. So, for example, in the case of John Paul II, there was a French nun who was healed of Parkinson's disease. She said, "It feels like I have a new body and new limbs." And there's a lady in Costa Rica called Florevet, and she had a brain aneurysm, which is just healed practically overnight. And that was through her and her family praying to John Paul II, which leads to the earlier point about the saints are interceding for us. So that is a part of the process of the church saying, we think this person is a saint. We offer this up to you. And showing that these results of intercession by typically healing miracles of physical or mental healing, which is unexplained by medical science, that's kind of God's way of confirming that the discernment of the church is in fact a correct one.
Christopher Lamb, is there a more fundamental problem here? Do we still believe in miracles?
Well, I think we do, as far as we have the evidence to believe that they've taken place. And I think in the case of Pope John Paul II, there was some good evidence to suggest there were miracles. Interestingly, Pope Francis decided on the same day that he would canonise John Paul II. He would also canonise John the 23rd without a miracle, a second miracle. So I think the Pope has shown that miracles, while important, are not fundamental to declaring someone as a saint.
Yeah, I think the question of miracles is an interesting one because they're problematic in lots of ways. I mean, there were people who questioned the first miracle of JP2 because when you're into this sort of realm, you don't really, it may be unexplained now, but it may not be unexplained in a year's time. So there are these sort of issues. And I think the reason why we have miracles, or the reason why the church goes on about miracles, is in fact that when the cult of the saints, in a sense, was at its height, when they started this system of canonisation, a juridical process overseen by the papacy, when they started that, the notion of saints was actually slightly different to what we have today. I mean, Ed quite rightly said that they're put forward as inspiration rather than imitation. That's for sure. I mean, you can't actually imitate being a pope, can you? But in the Middle Ages, what they were actually looking for was evidence that this individual had power with God, and so they prayed to him or her. And they collected miracles. I mean, this was in the archives. There are great quantities of these collections of miracles for the saints, not many of which we wouldn't think of as miracles these days, but there we are. But anyway, they wanted evidence that the person was powerful with God. And in a sense, the demand for miracles is a relic of that and could well be done without, frankly.
I did a bit of research on this. One saint, I think it was about the 9th century AD, Saint Denis, he was martyred after he was executed, but he picked up his head, walked 10 kilometres to a new burial site, and that was one of the said miracles. So I guess you feel that...
cathedral on the spot.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's a bit difficult to believe. However, you have actually raised the point that you don't need a miracle to be a martyr. If you've actually died, you don't have to produce a miracle, even in the present dispensation. You don't have to produce a miracle to prove you're a saint. If you've died for the faith.
It's certainly the case that everyone who's been martyred for their faith is considered a saint, and that, of course, there are millions of martyrs who have not gone through this process, partly because we don't know about them, often because they were living under totalitarian regimes. There may be people who've been martyred in China at this time, for example. The Church considers these people saints because of that demonstrates the fortitude and the courage that it is implicit in the heroic virtues.
Ed Rennie, what's your opinion of miracles? Would you agree with Michael that maybe they are of a time past, perhaps?
I don't think that's the case, because if you look back very traditionally, saints were made by popular proclamation. That's by the local church. The introduction of miracles is actually something more recent than that. But I think also it's not redundant in the sense because we are talking about the faith of a living God who has an interior reality. And we're trying to move towards kind of practical atheism. It's interesting, John Paul II did actually talk about this. And there is a danger for our faith that if we're living day to day as if God didn't exist. And I think that's possibly a difficulty for us, living in the world as it is, which is so, in the Western world at any rate, where the divine and the spiritual has been, to a large extent, pushed out of the common life. That's not a road I think we should go down on, bearing in mind that traditionally miracles were not required.
Christopher Lamb?
I think the key thing about saints, as far as I understand it, is this idea that a cultus develops around them. Cult's not a very good word. It's that people genuinely believe this person is holy. And a lot of people feel that about John Paul II. On the day of his funeral, they said Santo Subito, saint now. Even more so, probably, in Italy with John the 23rd, they felt he's been a saint for a long time. And I think that's actually the most important thing, whether or not the ordinary faithful feel there is something holy about this person. And I think the problem with the miracle is that we say, right, well, we have to have a miracle now, when actually this holiness is coming through. And I take your point about the sort of living as if God doesn't exist, but then, of course, we also have the quotation from our Lord himself saying, happy are those who have not seen yet still believe. And to have evidence all the time that this person is holy from miracles, I think might be kind of overplaying it a bit.
I don't disagree with that. I just wanted to say that I think the importance of what I'm saying is not to dispense with miracles entirely. Our faith is founded upon the resurrection of someone who is God incarnate. And I just think there's a danger that if we're putting miracles to one side, saying they're redundant entirely, that's a dangerous process when the founder of our faith miraculously resurrected from the dead and ascended into heaven. Now, if we're saying that, that's the foundation of our faith. We can't reject that and still call ourselves Catholic Christian. That is essential to our belief, and therefore to dispense with miracles entirely would, I think, ultimately undermine our faith.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia from London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm discussing the canonisation of Pope John Paul II. Michael Walsh, moving swiftly on to the canonisation of John Paul II, hasn't his canonisation been almost fast-tracked? Has it been too hasty?
Well, I think almost all canonisations these days are too hasty, frankly. I mean, there used to be you had to wait 50 years, but nowadays they can introduce a cause within 5 years, and then sometimes they get pushed through. I think it's a mistake, frankly, to do that, because you have to really sit around and find that this person is of enduring importance in the life of the Church, and not simply something like JP2 may very well be of enduring importance in the life of the Church. I'm not necessarily knocking him, but you do have to see that the cult of this person survived. I mean, I think talking about the cult, the devotion to an individual, is actually very important, because that is really quite serious, a quite serious issue. And I think it's a problematic one, because it's quite evident that people foster cults for their own reasons. Founders of religious orders are always canonised, so the orders, people in the religious order are always fostering, even if people in the whole have never even heard of this individual, you know. But there is the case, the interesting case, which we have today, and we know that things are changing about this, but the case of Oscar Romero, the Archbishop of San Salvador, in El Salvador, who was shot while saying Mass. Now, there's a great devotion to him. I mean, I was in Latin America many years ago. There were hymns already in the hymn books to him as a saint, despite the fact the Church had never declared him a saint, and still hasn't. Not only is not a saint, but not even a blessed. And this is where the politics comes in, because it's a good question to ask, why not, despite the fact there being a devotion? Whether or not there are miracles, I have no idea. But despite the fact that there's a great devotion to him, he's been denied the status of saint up to now. Now we have a Latin American Pope. It seems to have changed all that.
But your initial point was kind of let history decide.
Well, yes. It is a very difficult process. You know, when you decide you're going to canonise somebody, they have to read through all that person's writings and then judge them, because it'd be terrible if you actually canonised a heretic, wouldn't it? So you have to read through everybody's writings. And that all takes time. And as I say, you've got to hold them up to judgment of history as to whether these people really are as significant a person down the centuries as they appeared to be at the time that they died. The other thing about them is that it's sometimes the least likely people who are the most popular. If we talk about the cult, they're sometimes the least likely people who are the most popular, not people like John the 23rd, who certainly was very popular, but he was a well-known character. But somebody like Benedict Joseph Labra, for whom there was an enormous devotion in Rome, but then you wouldn't want to imitate him. He lived on a dunghill. But he had this extraordinary life. And it's that, I don't really think that's the problem for me. I don't think that John Paul II did lead an extraordinary life. But certainly Benedict Joseph Labra did.
Lots of points there, but I think we'll stick to, in terms of haste, Christopher?
Well, traditionally, a while ago, and Michael will correct me if I'm wrong, there used to be a 50-year mandatory waiting period between someone dying and a cause for canonisation opening, because there has to be a cause, has to be open. And then it was reduced to 5 years. And then Pope Benedict XVI for John Paul II said, right, we're not even going to wait the 5 years for this cause. So I think there has been haste with John Paul II, and we'll have to just wait and see. I mean, I personally would like there to be more time, and I think than John Paul II. I think in some ways, by doing it too quickly, you sort of detract from the man himself. I think if you let it happen in the right process, then actually, well, we will see, and we will judge whether John Paul II has got that devotion, that sanctity. I'm not denying for a second that he's a saint. I'm sure he is, but I think the time thing is important, and I think they should have waited, because you leave yourself open to the charge that this is being done for political reasons, and the people are pushing this forward too quickly, and you actually end up detracting from the greatness of John Paul II, who I think was a great man and an extraordinary man.
But when you get people shouting "Santo Subito," millions, it's almost surely the people's will should play a part.
Yes, it should. It should. But at the same time, the time thing is important. And if they're still shouting "Santo Subito" in 10, 20 years' time, well then, yes, let's do it.
Ed, Rennie?
We have to recognise that originally in the history of the Church, it was by popular proclamation. It was the devotion of the people in the local church. This is someone who has a significant personal devotion throughout the global church. He was particularly important for those churches that were in developing countries. And I think also this is haste, but is it just haste? And this is where the miracles come back in, because the miracles are very useful in quashing this concern of being incautious. Because here we have two very distinct medical miracles. And to go back to an earlier point about only miraculous healings are done, I think the point is that the modern process now is deliberately to exclude those things which aren't miracles, which do have a natural explanation. Or, for example, where someone claims a miracle has happened and where they've been healed and they haven't been healed. I mean, for this lady from Costa Rica, she's had to go through neurological screenings to demonstrate to the world, because essentially it becomes a kind of evangelistic thing. It's saying to the world, God is real. God is a reality acting in people's lives who believe in him, who trust in him, and this is something for everyone. And that is, I think, very much implicit in who John Paul II was, in who Karol Wojtyła was before he became Pope. And I think if you think about the time, also you look at his life all the way leading up to when he was Pope. I think that is where I think most people, most lay people and atheists will say that is the extraordinary time, when he lived under those totalitarian regimes, when he somehow managed to become a priest under the Nazi regime, where he managed to open a seminary under the communist regime, and where he was constantly battling against the attempt to destroy the faith and the attempt to destroy the Catholic Church in Poland, when the Catholic faith was so intrinsic to the identity of Poland. It was a deliberate strategy by the communists. They wanted to destroy this culture and say, we want to get rid of all that. We want to destroy the understanding that God exists from these people, because it's only the state, it's only Marxist, Leninist communism which provides for you. God doesn't provide for you. We, the socialist democratic republic, it's not a republic and it's not democratic, but we provide for you, not God.
There used to be another aspect to canonisation, which I think is a shame we've lost, is the devil's advocate, who would actually put the case against someone being a saint. And in John Paul II's case, if there was a devil's advocate, I think they would be speaking about the problems to do with sex abuse and the terrible scandal of the Legionaries of Christ, a religious order whose founder was turned out to be an utter fraud and an abuser himself, who John Paul II, well, we don't know how much he knew, but certainly during his papacy, this scandal did come to light. Now, I'm not saying that a saint should be, or someone's cause for sainthood should be got rid of because they made mistakes, because of course that's not the point. They don't have to be perfect people. But there is that case against the papacy of John Paul II. Of course, there was a great good, but there is that. And I think that this is the whole point about the haste question. Do you want to push through something when other evidence may be coming to light? And this whole question of the devil's advocate, well, none of us are perfect.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm discussing the canonisation of Pope John Paul II. Joining me in the studio to discuss this is Ed Rennie from the media project Catholic Voices, Christopher Lamb, assistant editor for The Tablet, which is an international Catholic weekly newspaper, and Michael Walsh, a Catholic author and historian. That's an interesting point. Can a saint be human? Can a saint make human error?
That's the whole point about being a saint, is that
Yes.
you don't follow, as you were saying, you don't imitate the saint, and the saints make terrible mistakes, but the saint continues despite the problems.
Michael Walsh?
Well, of course you can be a saint. I mean, look at St. Augustine. And make me chaste, but not yet, he said famously. I think, well, in one sense, we're talking about the canonisation of JP2. The thing that strikes me about this, I mean, I entirely take the point about Maciel, the founder of the Legionaries of Christ, being a serial abuser. And it does seem, because as soon as we had a change of Pope, and Benedict XVI came along, the first thing he did was basically to dismiss this man and send him off to his novitiate, where he never went, in fact, but that's where the Pope wanted him to go. Did seem as though somebody was protecting him, and as soon as there was another Pope, that stopped. So that is a serious question. I think that an even more serious question for me is whether we should be canonising popes at all, not just in a hurry, but at all, because it seems a very odd thing for one pope to canonise basically somebody who was more or less his predecessor but one. Anyway, I mean, I know Gregory VII in the Dictatus Papae back in the 11th century says all popes are saints. I mean, if Edward Gibbon were alive today, he saw the Roman papacy as a reincarnation of the Roman emperor. Well, I think he would now see the popes deifying their ancestors. That's what it looks like.
But I guess as Ed pointed out earlier on, Pope John Paul II was one of the most influential figures of the 20th century, not just to Catholics, but to everyone.
Yes.
Does that exempt him at all from your point of you shouldn't make a Pope a saint?
Well, no, I don't think it does. I'm not necessarily saying you shouldn't make a Pope a saint, but it does seem to me that if you're doing that, you've got to give a decent length of time between one Pope and the next, as it were, before he gets round to doing it. As I say, it does look like deifying his ancestors, which is not a very good example
or
to the world
his
at large. Maybe his mates, yes, I mean, absolutely. So popes are in a particularly difficult position. And the interesting thing was, the number of popes who have been canonised is actually quite small, apart from those in the early church who weren't, as Ed would point out, had been canonised by popular acclaim by the people in their own diocese. But apart from that, the number of the popes that have been canonised is actually really quite small. But certainly since the process of canonisation began formally in the 13th century with the judicial process, the judicial system, there's been very few indeed. In fact, there was one in the 16th century, Pius V, who was a particularly bad thing for the English Catholics. So that was a mistake. But since Paul VI, they've just come one after another, and it seems to me to give a wrong impression of what the Pope is doing and what the Church stands for.
Christopher?
Yeah, I think we should be, the Church should be able to canonise popes if it sees that's correct. I think my issue with the canonisation of popes is the message it sends out. It's similar to what Michael's saying, is that the point about being a saint and being holy is that it should be achievable by the lowliest person in the church, by anyone in the church. The problem with continually canonising popes is you make it out that being pope is somehow being a saint, and that is a bit of an issue because, as I said, we all make mistakes, we're all human. And the whole point about holiness and being saintly is that it is possible for anyone in the church to do, regardless of position. That would be my concern about canonising popes one after the other.
I think understandably the canonisation process for John Paul II has garnered a lot more attention from the world's media, and that's perfectly fine. That's not a criticism of the world's media. But I think, as has been mentioned, proportionately, popes do not form the majority of canonizations. I mean, I think in particular of Edith Stein, who was gasped in the Holocaust. But I think there is a reality here. If I just quote John Paul II, he says, "They try to understand me from outside, but I can only be understood from inside." Now, I think what he's talking about there is that, and this applies to all those others who've been sainted as well, is that it's the interiority of the faith that exists in him, and it's the outworking of that interiority. I think what is clear about, in terms of his beatification specifically, is that those who knew him best testify to this immense hope, this dynamism, this radical dynamism of the person of who he was, and that to be around him. I mean, there was one, I think, policeman who hadn't been to Mass for years. He encountered John Paul II for the briefest of moments as John Paul II was greeting a disabled child. And he walked away in tears and said, "I've got to go back to Mass." He didn't even speak with him. It was just to be in his physical presence. And I think that is where we begin to understand what it is about saints, that the reality of who they are is just to be around them draws you closer to Christ, draws you closer to your faith. It deepens your faith. And the famous prayer in the Gospels that says, "Lord, I have faith, but help my faith." And that is what the saints do. This is the inspiration that we've touched on briefly. It's to deepen the faith, and also to proclaim it to the world, to the rest of the world, to say this is reality. There is an answer to the major questions of life. And that, I mean, I'd like to draw on some of John Paul II's philosophical work. I mean, that there's a profound, lengthy work he did on the theology of the body, which is, celebrating sexuality, celebrating marriage, and the work he did in incorporating philosophical traditions like phenomenology. There's a whole, I mean, I've covered it extremely briefly, but there's a whole area of work of who he is. And the people that know him, that testify to who he was, say this about him.
We almost run out of time, but I'd like to ask you each very briefly, and very bluntly perhaps as well, do the majority of Catholics care whether John Paul II is made a saint or not? Ed?
Majority of practicing Catholics who take their devotion seriously, certainly, absolutely. But I think even those who would perhaps call themselves semi-detached or lapsed or whatever, I think it's of interest to them, and I think they probably would say it was, even if they don't have the same level of concern as those who are very devoted to their faith.
Christopher?
To a certain generation who grew up only knowing Pope John Paul II for much of their life, I think it is important. But I think for a large number of practicing Catholics, I think they know if someone is holy or not, and if the church says, well, this person's a saint, this is why, there are these miracles, I think that is perhaps secondary to their instinctive understanding of holiness.
And Michael?
Well, as I go to Mass on Sunday in my local parish church, I don't think they care very much about what goes on in Rome at all, whether they're canonising popes or issuing encyclicals. It doesn't impact their lives.
Just want to add, there's a 19-year-old friend of mine who's reading the latest encyclical, and I've never seen her in such a profound state of thought. And admittedly, she was a reasonably devout Catholic in the first place. But if this new encyclical, which I've not read yet, is as profound as her reaction was, then I think that maybe begin to contradict what Michael just said at the end there.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'd just like to thank all my guests, Ed Rennie from the media project Catholic Voices, Christopher Lamb, assistant editor for The Tablet, which is an international Catholic weekly newspaper, and Michael Walsh, a Catholic author and historian. Thank you very much for joining me, Tim Walklate, on The Voice of Russia in London.